Good evening. Sorry, I'm a little flustered. This is another example of why I appreciate Robbie Worrell so much, coming in here to do this recording on my own and trying to get things lined up and get the camera right, get the angles right, and then check it and then try and get it lined up. And it's just really nice to have somebody here to do all that stuff. So shout out to Robbie for doing such a great job keeping us lined up. And so obviously if suddenly the camera seems crooked or tilts on its own, or I'm not in the shot, any of that is solely my responsibility. So we are in a continuing study about Christians and politics, and really what we're talking about, this is a worldview class. How do we have a worldview, a biblical worldview, that extends into all aspects of our lives, including how we practice politics, and by extension, how involved we get in politics, and how we vote. These are real world things, not just because it's an election year. This is a part of life. So I'm glad to be able to be here and talk about this a little more. It continues to be odd to not have people in this class, and this would have been more fun to do in a group discussion. We've talked about some different ways. I've had some suggestions about some different ways to do this as a group discussion with Zoom and some other things. And I just am a little leery about how that would work, since you would be coming into the class without having done any reading or anything. But maybe as we move forward and we do some book studies or things, some Bible book studies where people can read ahead and have read the chapters, maybe we'll dabble with some more of those types of things. We've been talking about, in this class, we moved past some issues of some good principles to apply to our political lives, and now we've moved into talking about some issues and trying to see if the Bible speaks to these issues, and if so, what it has to say, and to contemplate whether our thinking as individuals needs some adjusting. And so we started out, so far we talked about poverty, and we spent a couple weeks on that, or a couple weeks ago. The last time we were together, we were talking about this issue of creation care or environmentalism, and especially from the perspective that, biblically speaking, as God's people, we're called to be stewards of the earth. And so what does it mean to be stewards of the earth? And what might it look like if we as Christians who are also practicing politics, what would it look like for us as Christians to have stewardship of the earth as a motivating force in our politics? So some interesting things we were able to talk about. With all of these, it's not like we're going to get to the end and we're going to have these 3 easy checklist items. If you just do this, everything will get fixed. These are complex issues, and we're going to see that in particular as we come today to an issue that is near and dear to our hearts, I think, for many of us, the issue of immigration. And really, this is part of a larger conversation that we're not going to really be able to have in this class. It's a question of, in the larger context, in the global context, how we as Christians are good neighbors, how we practice the second greatest command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so this spills over into a lot of different aspects of politics. This spills over, or should spill over, into our environmentalism, into the way that we practice foreign policy, the way that we look at diversity and respecting people from different backgrounds, and certainly the way that we talk about immigration. So again, we're not going to come close to covering this thoroughly in this conversation. I should look at the clock and see about when I started, to have some idea, because this could go, I have a lot of scripture, and I think instead of reading most of this, what I will do to give you a little more control over the length of this class is I think at several points I'll pop up a screen with some scriptures and encourage you maybe to pause the video and go read them on your own and think about what they say and how they are relevant or not relevant, you may decide, to this conversation. So, to give us some perspective, I think we should start with some statistics. Statistics can be used and manipulated to do all sorts of things. We're certainly seeing that now in the COVID-19 crisis. Anybody who wants to make a point can find some statistics to support their ideas. So we have to be careful with statistics, but they're also useful. And so I think that plays into some of what we need to talk about today. I want to start with the idea that we need to always, as Americans, more so than many other countries, we would describe ourselves as being a nation of immigrants. We say that a lot. We don't maybe always know exactly what it means or appreciate what it means, but I think it's largely a true statement. And some of that is statistical evidence. Columbus discovered this part of the world. That's a larger conversation too. But let's say 1492, he arrives here to a new world in which Experts would vary somewhat on their estimates, but anywhere, depending on who you talk to, between 2 million and 18 million Native Americans already live here. So I think maybe just for the point of discussion, let's just say there are about 10 million people already here who lived on the land and considered this to be home, and probably didn't give much thought to people coming from other places and wanting to live here. And so fast forward from 1492 to Thursday, April 30th, which is when I originally put this down on the paper. The estimated population in America on Thursday, April 30th, 2020 was 330,674,090. Not 91, not 89, 90. That's a big increase. That's a lot. There's a lot more people here now. What is interesting is that by the year 2044, which used to sound, a long way off, and now doesn't sound very far off. By the year 2044, we will be a nation that's composed entirely of minorities. And what I mean by that is that there will be no ethnic group in our country that will comprise more than 50% of the population. So that's the year that America is expected, if demographics hold true, and those estimates are pretty solid, will dip below 50% Caucasian. And just in case you didn't know this, it's already happened in a number of states. Hawaii, California, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, and the District of Columbia are already less than 50% Caucasian. Maryland will be soon. And then there are some other states that are already below 60%, and they will be the next to fall in line. So Georgia, Florida, Arizona, New York, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Louisiana. And so if you're wondering why that matters, well, by comparison, in 1950, it's not all that long ago, America was 90% Caucasian. So that has changed, and a lot of that has had to do with, not all, but a lot of that has had to do with immigration, especially the last century in America. So America is a nation of immigrants. We are also, I would not have always said this, you've heard me say before, this is different than it was 30 years ago when I moved here, 32 years ago, 31 years ago. We are a congregation of immigrants. Conestoga Valley Church of Christ is a church full of immigrants. A growing number, I don't know what the percentage is, but we would all say a growing number of our church members were born in another country, born somewhere else. And I started going down through a list, something that Glenn Hart was working on a while ago, and I was looking through it. I'm sure that this is not complete, and I deeply apologize if I miss your nation of origin, and I'm sure I'll miss several, but I know for a fact that we have people in our congregation who originally are from the Philippines, El Salvador, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Uganda, Cuba, Kenya, Jamaica, China, and the Congo. I believe it's Democratic Republic of Congo is what it's called now. And so that has changed our congregation. That has shaped our congregation. I would argue it has shaped our church in amazing and profound and positive ways. I can't think of a negative way. But it's changed us. And I think as an example, it's really cool as we've been going through this COVID-19 thing. I'm here on every Sunday morning with a group of 4 guys. Robbie does the tech, and Danny is here sort of as, he's bilingual, so he's a man in two assemblies. So I preach at 9, and Danny helps with the Lord's Supper, and then at 10 o'clock Isaac comes and preaches. And it's really been great for me. Normally, late service, I'll preach in English, and Isaac's son, Isaac Jr., is in a quiet room translating my sermon into Spanish, and so I don't hear what that sounds like. But now I'm sitting in this room at 10 o'clock, and I'm listening to Isaac preach his own sermon in Spanish, and I'm watching it. As I'm watching him, I'm watching it on live stream, and I'm watching all these people coming in and interacting, and I'm watching Danny getting on Facebook and interacting in Spanish with those people, and I don't even know what they're talking about, but it's beautiful. And I think that this is a really good thing. I'm excited about this. I'm excited when I walk through our lobby and I see people that I'm able to converse with because they can speak English. I can't speak another language. They're able to talk to me, but then I see sometimes they're over in a group and they're speaking a different language in our lobby, and it's a good thing. We're together. We're a unified church, despite the diversity of our ethnicities and our nations of upbringing. And so that's an important perspective. We are more and more, and I hope we'll continue to become more and more a congregation of immigrants. I think it's also worth noting, if you've never really thought about it before, I think this is incredibly significant to this conversation, Christians and politics. And that is that the Bible is a book of all nations. It's a book for all nations. It's a book about all nations. God's plan is for everybody. Adam and Eve in the garden are the parents of the human race, not the parents of the American race or the Caucasian race. Who knows what their skin looked like? Who knows what language they spoke? They were the father of all of us. God's plan of redemption is not just for a certain group of people, at least in terms of that. It's for a certain group of people who will follow it, but it has nothing to do with what language you speak or where you were born. So that's something I think worth celebrating, that the Bible truly is a book that offers God's love and God's plan for everybody, for all nations. And I think in particular, you can't help but notice this if you're paying attention when you read through the New Testament and when you see what the early church is doing. You see such an incredible emphasis on the ethnic diversity that exists between the people of God. And so let me just show you a couple of scriptures. This would be a good place, I think, for you to consider maybe pausing this video and going and reading these for yourself. Very, very briefly, I just want to point out a couple things as you go through there. That first passage, Matthew 25, in verse 32, it says, all the nations will be gathered before Christ. And of course, in the second passage of the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, verse 18 of Matthew 28. And this powerful passage at the beginning of the church in Acts chapter 2, yes, it was a gathering of Jews that are there for Passover when this great miracle of the apostles being able to speak in different languages. But why did they need to do that? Well, because as it says in verse 5 of chapter 2, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven were gathered there. And it goes on to list them. And it's an incredible list. And then in Galatians 3, verse 28, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, male or female. We're all one in Christ. And then, of course, as we just finished a study of Revelation, I think some of the most powerful moments in Revelation come when we get these glimpses of worship in heaven. When the kingdom is fully realized after Jesus comes back and does the things he's going to do at the end of time and takes us all home, we have these incredible accounts like we see in chapter 7 of a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language. And so it's clear, I think, that this is a very significant, important theme in the New Testament that reinforces what the scriptures say, what the Bible says as a whole. But I think what Christians should take from that, there's a number of things we should take from that. If we were here in a class, I would ask you this. I would say, well, what do you think we should take from that? And you would have some thoughts, and they would probably be pretty good. I think it's not hard to pinpoint some of these things. Certainly, we would talk about how this must mean that God loves and values and has compassion for all people from all nations. There's just no question about that. I think we would also agree, I hope we would also agree, that God does not set one ethnic group over, above, or ahead of another ethnic group as favored status because they speak a certain language or their skin has a certain tone or they're from a certain geographic region. I think we would agree to that. And I hope that we would agree that since the days of Israel, God has not favored a nation. This might be a little more, we might have a little more conversation about that for some of us who might think that America is the new Israel, which I do not personally believe, but blessed certainly, but not God's physical kingdom here on earth, like Israel was intended to be. But I think that's significant, the realization that God does not value any nation above any ethnicity, any language above any others. And really, ultimately, this should be foundational to how we end up as Christians viewing immigration. And perhaps even, it should extend into our foreign policy, which I guess is a subject we're probably not going to have a lot of time to talk about. And yet, I think as Christians, sometimes this subject sort of takes a back seat. What we just read in Scripture just sort of takes a back seat to other concerns in our lives. And those concerns end up becoming a higher priority for us. They end up mattering more to us. They're things that we worry more about than perhaps whether we're representing or treating immigrants the way that we should. And so here's a sampling of some of those things. I think one of the things that, as we talk about the immigration issue, one of the things you hear very often is, well, some of those immigrants who are coming in are probably going to be hostile to our way of life or our faith, and so we're worried about terrorism. And there's this idea of, well, as citizens, we're required to follow the law, but sometimes we think immigrants are not. And so they get away with some things, or they're able to get financial support or social services that maybe citizens don't get by virtue of the fact that they're illegal. And so for us, I guess that's an issue of fairness, right? We don't think it's fair that anybody should be able to skirt the law. And there's a concern about jobs, and perhaps that immigrants are coming in and willing to do certain jobs at a lower rate of pay than I might be willing to. And so is that fair? And there's this, I think I sort of mentioned this earlier, the cost of social services. It's estimated, again, statistics are very suspect, and I can tell you this number came from a very anti-immigration website. But it's the only place I saw a number, which their estimate was it costs about $130 billion a year to support social services for immigrants. Again, don't quote me on that, but I think the point that most would agree is it's a big number. It's billions of dollars. And so that's an issue. We're worried about the budget, and we're especially worried about it now as we're spending trillions of dollars on other things. And then, not to be neglected, I think this is something that plays into this as well, is that some of us worry about how these new people, if they're able to at some point get the right to vote, how will they vote? And we worry that the new people coming in are going to vote for the party that we're not a part of. And so maybe we should just keep them out because it might be political disadvantage. And so those things all play into our concerns. And the bigger question is, these are legitimate things to discuss, to ask questions about, to be concerned about. But I think probably there's different levels of appropriateness as to how much we need to worry about that, or how much that should really drive us as followers of God. We're trying to do the right thing. And so that's the question. Do these concerns fit into a true biblical worldview? Is it a legitimate biblical worldview if I'm worried more about those things than I am about maybe some more specific things that the Bible says about immigration? And so those things are worth considering. Some more statistics. In the last 50 years or so, worldwide, more than 190 million people have changed the nation of their location. That's incredible. I know 50 years seems like a long time. Doesn't seem that long to me, but that's a lot of people. That's a ton of people that were born one place and moved to live somewhere totally different. I was born and raised within 50 miles of here. Have lived in some other places, but not ever very far from here for very long. I can't imagine living in another country, learning a new language, but that's common for a lot of people. And in fact, about 3% of the world's population has changed locations in that amount of time, in those 50 years. What you may not have known, and I didn't know until I started reading about it, is really there's less than 30 countries that really benefit or receive a lot of immigration. There's a lot of places that you probably, it's not very appealing to go there, so they're not getting a lot of immigrants. Typically, Europe gets almost a third of all the immigrants, and the United States is not far behind. And so those are the two big geographic areas that account for coming up on 2/3 of all the immigration that happens. And really, there are two primary reasons why you might see somebody as an immigrant moving to another nation. And it's thought of in these conversations as push and pull. People sometimes are they're forced out of their homeland. This can be a political situation that their life is in danger, or an economic collapse that makes it impossible to survive, or it could be a natural disaster, like a famine or something like that, or it could be a war that that is targeting the members of their ethnicity, and so in a sense they are pushed out. They just can't stay there anymore, and so leaving their homeland, they've got to go find somewhere else, and so they're drawn to other countries. On the other end, you have the pull, immigration by pull, which is people who live one place but they're looking somewhere else and thinking, all right, I'm surviving here, but if I could live there, I could do more than survive. If I could live there, I would have opportunities. If I could live there, my family would be safe. If I could live there, I wouldn't be so hungry or have to work so hard just to get to tomorrow. And so that's the draw. Some nations, because of their freedom, because of their prosperity, because of the promise of a better life. That is a very compelling thing. And if you've lived in this country your whole life, maybe that's hard to understand, why people would get up and leave their country just because there's a chance it might be better somewhere else. But talk to some of our immigrant members who have fled dangerous situations or situations that were hostile to their family, and understand that the draw of a better life is a powerful magnet. If you haven't lived somewhere where you have that promise out there, you probably don't understand that very well. I think as you look at some of these things, it's important to note that not every immigrant has the same story. We're all different, and our stories are different just as human beings, but this can be a problem, because when you get into an issue like immigration, as with anything else, generally you have two extremes, and then you have a lot of ground in the middle. But in particular, the extremes of the advocating for or against tend to use some of the logical fallacies that we've talked about before in other conversations, which is they'll come up with anecdotes or stories that describe all immigrants based on one scenario or one event, either positive or negative. And they'll say, see, this happened, and this proves that either immigration is awesome or immigration is terrible because of this event or this set of events or this statistic that we found that supports our contention. And so the reality is that, as with human beings in general, sometimes those stereotypical narratives fit us and sometimes they don't. So we have to be careful about that. We have to be careful in all of these issues with oversimplification, with drawing these lines like it's either this or it's this, and that's just how it's got to be. All right, let's talk a little bit about just immigration in general. I think it's worth mentioning. We pride ourselves, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, we pride ourselves on being a nation of immigrants, being immigrant friendly. In reality, in our country, our record on immigration is sort of mixed. And I think it's mixed in terms of who we allow in, and it's mixed in terms of how we have treated immigrants. And so, it always depends on how you want to frame the argument and who you want to talk about and who you want to leave out. So, I think it could be said, I read somewhere, I thought it was kind of a funny quote, that Native Americans living in America today wish that President Trump had built his wall 600 years ago, and maybe they would still have their country. So if you talk to somebody who is of Native American descent, you get a different perspective on immigration. It is true that America has been kind to many groups of immigrants, but also I think if you really look at it, in particular, because of the original formation of the original 13 colonies being primarily European in origin, we've been a little extra friendly to European nations. They tended to be the nations that had the most prosperity and the technology to send groups of people from their country to our country and to colonize and make it work, and to develop, they had systems of government that worked well, that adapted well to the wilderness and things like that. And so from the beginning, European immigrants have typically been favored and welcomed. I'm thankful for that. As a person of Dutch and German and English and Irish ancestry, I'm glad that my people were, for the most part, allowed to come here 200 years ago. It wasn't always quite that cut and dry. My little bit of Irish is easily hid, but if you were obviously Irish, there were times in our country where you were not welcome here. There were periods in our history where if you were Catholic, you were not welcome here. Certain Eastern European countries went through stretches where you were really not welcome here. But a lot of times those things could be overcome if you were willing to come and take on some menial tasks and sort of work your way up. It's also true, one of the big challenges that we have to deal with when we look back at our history is to understand that until fairly recently, within the last generation or two, most Africans who migrated to America migrated because of slavery. And so I don't know whether that would be push or pull. It's certainly not pull. But the fact that that's a part of our history too, that we have a segment of our population who was brought here as property against their will. And we have that's a big part of our national story. And so that's there as well. We have to deal with the fact that during World War II, if you were a U.S. citizen of Japanese descent, you probably ended up in what we call internment camps, what in other nations we would call a concentration camp, not a death camp, but a concentration camp. If you were of Japanese American ancestry, if you were of German ancestry or Italian ancestry, which we were fighting them too, you didn't get put into camp. So kind of interesting how that worked. It's interesting how in more recent times, in the last, say, 40 years or so, if you were what we would call an illegal immigrant from Cuba, you were welcomed and you were given benefits because the nation of Cuba was our enemy. And so we welcomed immigrants from Cuba. Whereas at the same time, from a similar location on the globe, if you were an illegal immigrant from Haiti, we would probably send you back because we were friendly with the Haiti government, the Haitian government. They were our friends. And so two different groups, similar circumstances, treated differently because of our political relationships with their nations. We went through a time in our country where the Chinese were welcomed in the 19th century in particular as a source of cheap labor, and in particular when we were really growing and developing the railroads in our country. A lot of our railroad system was built with Chinese labor, but then after a while they got too numerous and started to get persecuted. And in fact, the only actual race-based immigration prohibition in the history of America was called the Exclusion Act of 1882, and basically it was a law that was passed to limit specifically Chinese people from immigrating to America. So that's harsh. It's something to think about. And I have to say some of the policies of our current presidential administration have taken on a flavor of some of these exclusionary policies. They use terms and speak of things in ways we're not used to hearing from our leaders. And it's interesting to watch how different Christians respond to that. Some Christians are appalled or offended by it, and other Christians seem to be on board with it. So I don't know where you're at on that, but I hope that you're trying to consider things like the rhetoric from our current politicians in light of what you read in Scripture, and maybe not how you feel on a given day about the economy or something like that. So what about illegals in our country? Statistics, again, easy to manipulate, hard to find. As with everything else, again, I'm mindful of this with the COVID-19 stuff. Anytime you see a statistic on Facebook or on a news source, a headline and a number, go looking to see if you can find where it comes from. Because a lot of times people, you probably knew this, they'll use statistics to lie, or they'll use statistics to frame an argument. That's one of the things statistics are very useful for. And so, depending on where you were at on the spectrum of how you feel about illegal immigration, you have incentive to make the number bigger or to make it smaller. So I've seen numbers that say we have roughly about 10.5 million illegals currently in our country, and that number has come down. The number you see on the slide, 11.1 million, that was sort of a recent high point, and it's been declining since then. On the other hand, I've seen numbers as high as 14 or 15 million from websites that are very anti-immigration and want to prove that there are more illegals, and that's a fairly recent number. So I don't know what the right number is, and it's impossible to know exactly. There are always going to be estimates. More than half of our immigrants come from Mexico. That's probably not too much of a shock if you think about the relative prosperity of our border nations and some of the political issues that have been going on in Mexico. What is interesting is that the media, if you line up everybody who is illegally in America right now, from the one that just got here today to the one who's been here the longest, the one in the middle would have been here 13 and a half years. Long time. Which sort of, I think, defies some of the stereotypes of these illegal immigrants and what they do when they get here. And the numbers suggest that about 2/3, maybe more than that, of all illegal, hang on a second, I'm going to turn that light back on. About 2/3 of all illegal immigrants have been here at least a decade. Hang on. So I think you heard me say before the light went out that the median amount of time that an illegal alien has been here is about 13 and a half years. About 2/3 of all illegal aliens, or illegal immigrants that are currently in the United States have been here for more than a decade. So it's a long-term situation. And it's also, I think, interesting to note that kind of how we define this. We tend to think of illegals as always sneaking in around some border situation, and there's certainly some of that happens. about half of what we call illegal immigrants today actually come into the country illegally. The other half are people who at some point were granted a legal visa to come here and allowed to stay here, but at some point the visa expired and they didn't go back. And so the term in immigrant circles is actually that they have overstayed. So they're not, it doesn't quite fit the stereotype sometimes of what we have in our minds about all these immigrants who are here illegally and how they got here. And so I wonder, do these things fit into your stereotype, or are they challenging some of the things that you believe? Well, there are some solutions that are commonly proposed for this, and again, I think I said this before, I'm not here to give you solutions today. I don't think that there are easy solutions. I don't know if there's anything that would completely solve this or any other problem that we struggle with in our country. I'm more interested in how we as Christians are thinking about it and how it affects how we treat people and how we live in our witness as Christians, and how, as part of that is how we practice our politics. So you kind of have four main ideas, big picture ideas that are proposed as to how we fix this in America. Some people would argue that we need to just round everybody up who's illegally here, and we just need to deport them. But the question, if you really think about it, is how do you round up? First off, the number is squishy. We don't know exactly who everybody is or where everybody is, but let's assume we knew. How do you round up 11 million people? How do you round up, the population of greater Los Angeles combined with the population of Chicago, and just put them all on transportation and send them back to where they come from? How do you do that? There are estimates that if we could do that, even in theory, it would probably take 20 years to get everybody out, and estimates of up to $500 billion, and basically a couple $1,000s for every U.S. taxpayer to foot the bill to do this. So there's the economic side of that. But I think, to me, a bigger issue in this for us as Christians to consider is the side issue, if you will, of the fact that these people are not just abstract statistics. In many cases, they represent families, and families and children. And so there are some sticking points with this. For one, a child of an illegal immigrant who is born in America is a United States citizen. That's not just some rule that somebody made up. That's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And so not to be trifled with. And I know that President Trump is threatened to overturn that by executive order. Even if he did that today, it'd be a long battle with Supreme Court implications before that could happen. And I doubt whether it actually could happen, because it's right there. It's not easy to just say, yeah, I know the Constitution says it, but we're just not going to do that. So what do you do about those children who are American citizens? They're not illegal immigrants. They're legal immigrants. They have full rights as citizens. And it's complicated even further by the fact that some of those children, depending on where their parents originate, in a lot of cases, they have no legal status. If we were to send them back with their parents, because they're citizens of another country, they don't have legal status. So they're persona non grata in Mexico, in China, in places in Latin America. And so in effect, they would not be allowed to come home with their parents. And really, this ought to set us thinking about fairness. This ought to set us thinking about proportionality in law. Did I just make up a word? I hope not. A sense of proportion in law. We know that in the law, certain offenses are more serious. Sin is sin in God's eyes, but in terms of legal violations, some things are more serious than others, and they deserve a more serious punishment. And so if I am driving down Horseshoe Road over here and the speed limit's 50 and I do 52 and I get a ticket, okay, I exceeded the speed limit and I deserve a ticket for that. But I deserve less punishment for that than if I take a gun and I go assault somebody. They're different things. And I think we would all agree that, what is a proportional level of punishment? And the idea that deporting all illegals, no matter what their situation, which means that by definition we're going to break up some families. We're going to send some husbands home and with their wives behind, or some wives home with their husbands leave behind, or we're going to send some parents home with their children left behind. That does not seem like proportional punishment to me. And when we're talking about families in particular, as Christians, that should bother us. There's got to be a better answer that respects the law, but doesn't. I mean, think about what would have to happen to you in America for you to be taken away from your family. Think about the level of breaking the law that you have to do before they will go that far. It's a high standard, and I think we would all agree that's the right thing to do. I shouldn't lose my family for shoplifting a bag of carrots at Costco. I should pay a fine or whatever, but I shouldn't have my kids taken away from me. So we know that that's just not right. So as Christians, we need to struggle with things like that. But that's part of this conversation about deportation. There's also, of course, much ink has been spilled over the idea of a big, long wall, and that wall is being extended along our southern border. That's fine to some degree. It's not a solution because you can get over, under, and around the wall. And honestly, it's kind of amazing. I mean, our border with Mexico is 2,000 miles, almost 2,000 miles long. How do you patrol that? How do you manage that? You're never going to stop immigration over that border. And if Canada decides, or if people decide, well, I'm going to go in through Canada because there's no wall there, well, that's a 5,500 mile border that you can get around. And I don't know if you know this or not, but look at a map and it's shocking when you really consider the full size of our nation up into Alaska. We have like 95,000 miles of coastline. So if you really want to get into America and you can get a boat, you can get in. And so how do you patrol all that? How do you you can't put a wall around the whole country. So is that really a viable option? And then there's the notion of amnesty, which is, should we offer some sort of a path to citizenship for people who are in our country illegally? And we will talk about that a little more in the next couple of minutes. And then, of course, there's the good old status quo, which is, let's just put our head in the sand and pretend it's not a problem. Maybe it'll go away. More likely, we'll just say, well, we'll let the next generation figure that out, because that's a hard problem to fix now. The scriptures talk about immigration, and it's interesting. Again, if you were here, I would ask you to think about, can you name some of the Bible's great immigration stories? Let me take a pause and get a drink of water while you think about that for a second. What are the great immigration stories in the Bible? Turns out there's quite a few. Abraham was an immigrant. Moses was an immigrant. Daniel was an immigrant. Joseph and his family were immigrants. And really from that, we take the whole nation of Israel as a nation of immigrants, first to Egypt and then to the Promised Land. Jesus and his family started life under persecution as immigrants. And really even, you go read the first couple chapters in Acts, and you realize after Stephen's stoning that the church becomes, in a sense, a church of immigrants as they're scattered all over and as they start to move out of Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria and eventually even to all the ends of the earth. And so those early Christians are immigrants as well. There are a lot of other passages that speak to how God's people should think about this issue. And it's interesting to me that in the Old Testament, as far as I know, there are only 3 passages that really talk about or command God's people to love. And so the first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. These are not in chronological order. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 says, of course, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And that Jesus, of course, quotes that in Matthew 22. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which is also restated in Deuteronomy, says, love your neighbor as yourself. We know those two. That's the second greatest command. Again, Jesus restates that in Matthew 22. But did you know that in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 19, it says, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. And that really becomes the ethos of God's people under the law. Among the many things that they're supposed to remember that at one point they were immigrants. At one point they were foreigners. At one point they were exiles, and as we know, when we read the full history of God's people, they would become foreigners and exiles and immigrants again. But there are 92 different references to immigrants in the Old Testament, and here's a sampling of them, and I would encourage you again to sort of pause the video and go read these now. I think you'd be interested in what you read. They talk about leaving food in the fields for the poor and the foreigners. They talk about treating foreigners as though they were native born and applying the same laws to them, the same sense of, it's not law, law in the sense of justice. They should be treated justly as any native born people should. They should be judged fairly as any native born people should. And there's even festivals and times of giving in which it's commanded that you should give some of your prosperity to the Levites, the priests, and you should give some to the fatherless and the widows, and you should give some to the foreigners, and you should take care of them. And so we see that in the Old Testament, and I think we've already talked about how the New Testament speaks to that. I think the New Testament's focus is less on the law, because we're not under the law, under the New Covenant, but the New Testament speaks to this issue most emphatically when it talks about how the gospel, the good news, the plan of redemption is for everyone, and no one should be discriminated against. And so, really, among the overarching messages of the Bible is the message that immigrants are valuable. Immigrants deserve care, they deserve attention, and that Christians, as followers of God followers, Old Testament or New Testament, should value immigrants and should model compassion for them. And that word compassion is just a really powerful word. As you think about your political ideas and your ideas about other people, how often do you stop and say, okay, what's the compassionate view here? Because God wants his people to be compassionate. So, we start to ask some other questions. I think it'd be interesting to kick this around if we were all in the same room. How do we hold our responsibilities as Christians? How do we hold those things in sort of tension like stress, with our concerns about safety and about security and about fairness, because those are human things, and those are things we feel as citizens of whatever nation we live in. So how do we do that? And I think too, worth asking, how is there an opportunity for the church within this discussion of immigration and among what we would call minority groups? Are we missing out? Are we so obsessed with political solutions or things that support our political thoughts that we're not seeing the opportunities for the gospel that exist? Which I think is another thing that we really need to stop and consider how much that forms our politics, because if our living out our faith is not informing our politics, we've got other issues. So 2 things to leave you with as we wind down, and again, I have no idea how long I've been talking. 2 things I would say things to consider from 2 different sources as we close this session. A couple of years ago, I think it was in 2017, when we were doing our elder candidate program. We're still doing that, we just don't have any candidates right now. But we spent some time as a group, the elders and the preaching staff and the elder candidates spent a lot of time in prayer and study and discussion on this issue of immigration. And we drew up a paper. It wasn't super extensive, but we tried to pull together things that we thought were good ideas and things that we needed to contemplate and have as core values here on this subject. And a couple things that we came to agree on and affirm as leadership. We do agree that open borders they're sort of beyond our pay grade. Nations have a right to enforce and set borders, and that's really not something that we want to get involved in terms of determining, well, where should the border be? How open should the borders be? That really is a question for governments to take. But within that, we do think that it is right and fair as Christians to support that somebody who's in this country illegally who has an interest in becoming a citizen should have a path to citizenship, rather than deporting them, rather than some of the other solutions that we've set upon. Why not provide them with an opportunity to act responsibly and to become full citizens? Wouldn't that be a good thing? We also agreed that we would encourage Christian illegal immigrants, people who are here illegally for whatever reason. We would encourage them to pursue citizenship, to try to find that path if they could, and to avoid breaking the law. We don't want to encourage them, even though, again, the idea of proportional punishment, breaking up families and things, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. But it is important that as part of establishing yourself as a good citizen, that you obey the law. And so we want to encourage even illegal immigrants to do that. But we also wanted to say very clearly that immigration in any form, anything that brings more people to us, rather than having us have to go to another nation, anything that brings people to our door and in the front, and as a part of our church especially, is an incredible gift, is an incredible opportunity to share the gospel. And in fact, Matthew 28, the Great Commission, might bring us, because of that, this immigration might bring us more unchurched people. And in fact, Matthew 28, it's more important that we follow Matthew 28 than that we obey certain laws about immigration. In the hierarchy of what matters to God, the gospel matters. Sharing the story of Jesus with somebody who is lost and may also be here illegally, it's worth it. And then lastly, we did want to say, we never intend for this church to become a sanctuary church where we would encourage people who are breaking the law to come here and to take advantage of that. But we also do not intend to be people who are going around trying to figure out who's here illegally and who isn't, so that we can call the proper authorities and get them sent home. That is not who we are or what we want to be. So I thought you would want to know that. I thought it was worth putting that out. I want to close today with some recommendations from an organization that I came across called the Evangelical Table. And they offer some solutions. I think you'll see some similarities here. This is a group that's composed of evangelicals from different groups, different denominations, theological traditions, different ethnicities, different political perspectives. It's a broad-based group that's pushing for political change. And their ideas are biblically based, and I thought worth considering. As again, we try to allow the Word of God to shape our politics, to shape our worldview in every aspect. And so what this group, the Evangelical Table, is calling for is a bipartisan solution on immigration that is consistent with the biblical worldview. And in their mind, it includes these things. Respect the God-given dignity of every person. And this means that even if a country is encountering somebody who's trying to come into the country illegally, they should be treated with respect and dignity. That we should protect the unity of the immediate family, and that the idea of breaking up families to deport some and not others, that's a terrible thing and it's not a godly thing, and that we should stand against that. That we should respect the rule of law, though. Law matters, and nations, governments have the right, the biblical right, to establish law. That we should do our best to guarantee that our country is safe, that our borders are secure and free from terrorism and threats like that. And that we should ensure fairness to taxpayers, because it can be a burden when we're asked to pay for people who are here under false pretenses. And so how do we figure that out? How do we act compassionately without being taken advantage of? And then lastly, establishing this path toward legal status or toward citizenship for anybody who decides, I want to be a citizen, and who could qualify for that we should support that. I thought that was interesting. And perhaps, we can look for candidates and political parties who reflect those sorts of values as we make those values a part of who we are as Christians. I appreciate you listening. Again, I have no idea how long I've been talking, so I have a little bit of editing to do. There will be a dark patch there, and my phone usually stops the video, breaks the video into two, so there will be another cut like 22 minutes in. I'll have to splice that together, but hopefully I'll get this out and in your hands soon. Our next class is going to be on the subject of family, and I think that'll be an interesting conversation as well. And again, you've heard me talk about family in a couple of these different issues. When we talked about poverty, when we talked about immigration, all of these things are interconnected, which is one of the things that makes them so complicated to figure out and to try to understand. So thank you for paying attention, and I'll see you hopefully next week in this format.